Well, in the seventh paper, we are going to take up B Yeats, the author, prescribed for you in the second unit. Students with literature at the graduation level must be familiar with B Yeats. As a poem, The Second Coming was prescribed there. Here in today's class, we are going to deal with his life and the different phases of the poetic career. Broadly speaking, there are 4 stages we come across in his poetic journey. The early phase, the first one, the second, the middle phase, or the transitional phase also we call it, and the third one, the phase of complexity and maturity, and the fourth one, the last phase. B Yeats was born in 1865. He was the eldest child of John Butler Yeats, who had turned skeptic and who was an artist, a painter. Because of scarcity of money, he constantly had to shift his household from Dublin to London and from London to Dublin, and that's why his children, they had to spend most of the childhood days in Sligo with their maternal grandparents, who were well-to-do merchants there. And that's why we see that the scenic beauty of the Sligo Valley finds an extensive expression in most of his poems. He began to write poetry in his late teens, and his father encouraged him. His poetry initially echoes of Shelley, Spenser and the Pre-Raphaelites, but actually he aims to write for an Irish audience and about Ireland. He wanted to recreate a specifically Irish literature, and for that he busied himself founding literary societies, making speeches and writing articles and reviews in papers and journals in order to create a public sympathetic to his ideas and hopes for a distinctively Irish literature. He wanted to create a nationalistic fervor amongst the Irish people. But for about a year, he was also actively engaged in nationalist politics. Firstly, under the influence of Joan O'Leary, and then under the influence of Maud Gonne, who was the daughter of an English colonel and who had become a revolutionary. She was an exceedingly beautiful woman, and Yeats had fallen in love with her the moment he saw her at the very age of 23. And he came to know, or he was aware of the fact that his literary aims and activities were not likely to impress Maud Gonne, who was in favor of violent action. And that's why, in order to impress Maud Gonne, he joined the secret extremist revolutionary Irish Republican Brotherhood, this party, for about a year or so, but he was soon disillusioned by it after Maud Gonne refused to marry him, and she ultimately married Major Joan McBride. Well, coming to his poetic journey, it is divided into 4 phases. The first phase is the early poetry, or the early phase. It is roughly from 1885 to 1899. David Detches, about this early period, says, in his early period, he had no clear ideas concerning his relation to his Irish background. The influences on him were English rather than Irish, and in his treatment of Irish themes, he displayed the normal English romantic attitude towards things Celtic. That is, he rather grew up reading the English poets, and that's why they had a great influence on him. But he was very keen to write for an Irish audience and about Ireland. He wanted to recreate a specifically Irish literature. That is, he wanted to write about Ireland and the Irish people, and that's why he deals with Irish themes and tries to capture the Celtic spirit in his poems, though he does it with a romantic fervor in them. These earlier poems, we see, are remarkable for their dreamy sweetness and the traditional song-like ballad rhythm in the late Victorian Romantic tradition and the pre-Raphaelitic tradition, the Tennyson-Rossetti Modest tradition, and we find in them an added effort from the part of the poet to give the effect of Irish folk literature. And during this early period of his writings, the rhythm, the imagery, and the vocabulary that he chooses very carefully very clearly betray the fact that very consciously he has left the real world to transcend and inhabit a world of vision, a dream world full of fairies and supernatural beings strutting around. In Ireland, actually, at that time, people accepted the supernatural neither as an abstraction nor as a make-believe, but these were part and parcel of their lives, of their concrete experience. These were a physical reality for them. They lived with them, and that's why we find in his poetry an excessive use of Irish myths and legends, the Gaelic legends, the Cuchulainn saga, the tales of the Fianna, the fairy, and the folk tales all find a place in his poems, and they serve as traditional as well as personal symbols for him. This early poetry that appears utopian has a dual aspect. It conveys the poet's intense nostalgic yearning for an idyllic state of being, a dream world, and at the same time it also expresses his equally intense course that one cannot escape reality in this way. So he is aware of the fact that what reality is. So as we go through his works, we find that in him there is a rare combination of romanticism, realism, and spiritualism. Further, he was discontented with life, and for three main reasons. The first one, his monkish hatred for science and the increasing ugliness and barrenness of an industrial civilization. The Industrial Revolution and the First World War he was disillusioned with, and he was very much pained and disturbed by the after effects of the First World War. The second reason was his consciousness about the fact that in human life, conflicts and tensions, they exist and they disturb the lives of human beings. And the third one was the awareness of the fact that youth and beauty, they pass away with the passage of time, and he was pained to know that, and he lamented the fact in many of his poems also. Then the Rose group of poems, in them rose is a symbol that mostly stands for Maud Gonne, but slowly with the passage of time in the coming poems we'll see that this symbol fades away and newer symbols, they emerge. The Rose group of poems, the most dominant ones in this early phase, are at once a lover's homage to his mistress and a condensation of his philosophy, for to him all worship was one worship and all beauty the embodiment of a single idea. So in these poems we see his worship for the goddess of beauty, Maud Gonne. So these are Crossways, The Rose, The Wind Among the Reeds. They are some of his compilations during this phase. And the Rose group of poems, these contain most widely loved and most commonly anthologized of his poems. They please and will perhaps always please most readers who want no more than to accept self-evident beauty, that is, Readers who appreciate beauty in poetry find an ample feast in these poems. But in his later life, he himself grew impatient of his early style, and critics also agree with him. And it is not because of these that he is counted among the greatest poets of the 20th century. They are overshadowed by his later works, which far excel in brilliance to these poems, these early poems. And his later works, they have fewer readers, but they evoke deeper admiration. So the second phase is the realistic middle phase or the transitional phase, and roughly it is from 1902 to 1914. From the romantic poetry of the early stage, in this phase we see that there is a shift towards realistic poetry, and there are certain reasons behind this change or shift, and some of them are as follows. He was frustrated in his love for Maudgon, and that caused bitterness in him. Then he was dissatisfied with the reaction of the Irish people, the first reaction rather, who had disapproved Synge's play, The Playboy of the Western World, when it was for the first time staged at the Abbey Theatre. It caused a furore, and projectiles were flung at the stage. The Irish nationalists actually considered the content of the play to be an offence to public morals and an insult against Ireland, and they also perceived it as a slight on Irish womanhood. So this first reaction of the play disturbed him to quite an extent, though later the play was very much loved and appreciated. Then the pettiness and meanness of the Irish common men, this also disturbed him. Their selfishness, their hypocrisy, he could not bear. Then there was the Lane controversy. Hugh Lane, who was the nephew of Lady Gregory, he had offered his expensive French Impressionist paintings to the Irish people, but he demanded that there should be a gallery to place them. But the Irish people, they opposed his offer to lodge these modern paintings because they were against these modern paintings. So this also disturbed him. So this period of poetry shows a keen sense of life and reality, and is full of his disillusionment, impatience and indignation. So now he feels that things are not all that romantic, and reality seems to dawn upon him. And his poetry shifts from the emotional to rational, giving importance to reason, thought, and he especially started appreciating Swift and Berkeley, whose metaphysics he liked. And during this period, he learns to address this reality through a new vocabulary and new techniques. His language is stripped of poeticism, more and more prosaic words and are added from everyday speech. More and more colloquial, harsh, rugged and prosaic words are used, or they come into play. And for his epigrammatic terseness and concentration, he is appreciated, and he is compared to Dante by Edmund Wilson. The third phase is the phase of maturity and complexity. It roughly is from 1919 to 1933. This is the most important phase of his poetic career. The two poems prescribed for you, Sailing to Byzantium and Easter 1916, are also from this phase. The Irish Rising sank into the mind of the poet and merged with his whole philosophy of history. The Irish Rising, where there was a revolution against the English army, and ultimately the revolutionaries were caught and hanged publicly. Major McBride, Morgan's husband, was also one of them. So this rising is addressed to in his poem Easter 1916, that's prescribed for you, and he calls it a terrible beauty. A terrible beauty was born, he says in the poem. So this horror of violence and bloodshed haunted him, and along with it the atrocities inflicted on the common people by the British soldiers, the blacks and the tans. This reinforced horror in him, and this grim spectacle of the war is expressed in a number of poems of this phase. As R.A. Scott James also puts it, the spectacle of war in Europe and war in Ireland and quarrels between well-meaning men induced bitter reflections in him. So this is the phase when he has produced the best work of his life. The Tower group of poems, they include the finest poems of Yeats. Poems like 1919 and Sailing to Byzantium are seen as sheer products of genius. By the clarity of conviction and the mastery of technique that he has achieved by now, Yeats has reached the pinnacle of his power. He has mastered his art beautifully. Words seem to obey his call, and he writes with perfect ease and lucidity. So this richness that we find in his later poetry arises, as Jeffers calls it, the fullness of Yeats's life, because his style was reaching maturity at the same time as his life. So he had married Georgie Hyde Lees, whom he had known for quite some time now, in October 1917, and this marriage made his life serene and full of order, and it was the starting point for an altogether unexpected conjunction of his romantic and realistic traits of poetry. And these are a few themes which we find expression in his later poetry. So this phase of maturity and complexity is beautifully summed up by J.V. Breach, as he writes, in his later poetry, Yeats cultivated subtler, more varied and more dramatically balanced cadence music. His vocabulary is greatly enlarged with terms both from Irish as well as from English descent. The metaphors that he uses are fresher, and they are derived from a vast range of references, and the imaginative structure that he uses in these poems is also firmly wrought and spontaneous. The metaphysical also has crept in his compositions of this phase, providing them with an extra richness. So these are a few compilations that we come across from this phase of his poetry. So the last phase, the fourth and the last phase, that runs from 1935 to 1939. So now Yeats was growing old in peace. He had received the Nobel Prize, and this prize for poetry gave public recognition to his work. He had bought Thur Belili, a Norman tower in Galway, where he now lived for part of the year. He was happily married. The Yeats line was now secure, for the birth of his daughter was followed by that of a son. With this flowering of his life, when the opposites seemed conjoined, poet and Nobel Prize winner, man of action and senator, came the maturity of his style. He uses a symbolism which is direct speech. It records the richness of his life as well as its bitterness. But this troubled him, and in many of his letters, as the letter he has written to Olivia Shakespeare, he confesses the fact that he seems to have exhausted his capacity for personal experience, and this troubled him. Many of the critics like C.M. Baura, Stephen Spender and D.S. Savage have criticized him for a decline in his poetic powers towards the last phase. They find in them a simplicity both in tone and texture, but simplicity in vocabulary and diction doesn't mean triviality, and the rich and dark poems like Lepus Lazuli, The Bronze Head, etc. of the last phase continue to be as complex in poetic technique as the poems of the previous phase, and they seem to be fit answers to the criticisms levied by these critics against him. The intensely tragic tone that arises in this last phase is due to these three causes: the poet's awareness of increasing age. Old age was really torturing him, and the feeling that youth and beauty, they are vanishing with the passage of time. His consciousness of social reality and the catastrophe that threatens the world, that is, the impending dangers of the Second World War. He had seen the devastations caused by the First World War, and now the Second World War was near at hand. So this troubled him. Also, he was disturbed by a feeling that his friends are no more and the past order and tradition was gone. F.L. Lucas beautifully sums up the mood of the poet during this last phase. He tells us that his self-penned epitaph, "Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by," states the mood of the poet in the last phase. It is a mood of defiance, of cold detachment, which looks on life and death undisturbed. Horsemen are symbolic of bravery and heroism, and it is like a horseman that Yeats faces life up to the very end, unworried, unwearied as to what death had in store for him. So Keats was a fighter all his life. So we'll be reading the two poems prescribed for you in the next classes. So till then, goodbye. Thank you so much.